On the morning of December 12, 1718, 8 men were hanged in Nassau Harbor. They were pirates. That part was not in dispute. They had been tried 4 days earlier before a court of 7 commissioners in His Majesty's guardroom, found guilty on overwhelming evidence, and sentenced to death. The proceedings were orderly. The verdicts were just. The man who presided over the court was Woods Rogers, Royal Governor of the Bahamas, appointed by King George I, entrusted with the task of ending piracy in the Caribbean once and for all. One of the condemned, a man named Thomas Morris, climbed the gallows steps and looked out at the crowd that had gathered to watch. He said, "We have a good governor, but a harsh one." Then they hanged him. What Thomas Morris did not say, and what everyone present already knew, was this: the man who had just ordered his execution had spent years doing exactly what Morris had done. Woods Rogers had raided enemy ships under a royal patent. He had taken prizes at sea. He had commanded men who killed for profit, navigated the same grey space between war and crime that every pirate in Nassau understood intimately. The difference between Woods Rogers and the 8 men swinging in the harbor that morning was not courage, not violence, not appetite for the sea. The difference was a piece of paper with a royal seal on it. Whether that difference was everything or nothing is the question Woods Rogers spent his entire life answering. And the answer he gave was the one that ended an era. To understand what brought Woods Rogers to Nassau in 1718, you have to understand what the Caribbean looked like in the years just before he arrived. And to understand that, you have to go back to a war. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1702 and ran for 12 years, drawing in every major European power in a conflict over who would sit on the throne of Spain. For Britain, France, and Spain, the war was fought not just on European battlefields, but across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and on every trade route the competing empires depended on. Merchant ships needed protecting. Enemy shipping needed disrupting. And for both purposes, the crowns of Europe turned to the same solution: privateers. A privateer was a private captain operating under a government-issued letter of marque, a legal license to attack enemy vessels in exchange for a share of the proceeds. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate was, in theory, absolute. A privateer had authorization. A pirate did not. In practice, the distinction was considerably murkier. Both men used the same ships and the same tactics. Both targeted the same prey. The difference was the piece of paper authorizing it, and the nationality of the ships they were allowed to attack. During the war, thousands of men learned the trade of maritime violence under the protection of that piece of paper. As maritime historian Marcus Rediker argued in his study Villains of All Nations, the war produced a generation shaped by the sea into something neither the Navy nor the merchant fleet had any use for once the fighting stopped. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1714 ended the war. Overnight, thousands of trained, experienced, and unemployed sailors found themselves in Atlantic ports with skills that peacetime law did not accommodate. What they did was go to Nassau. The island of New Providence in the Bahamas had been without effective British government since 1703. The settlement that grew back in its place was something new. By 1713, Nassau's harbor had become the center of what historians now call the Republic of Pirates, a community of roughly 2,000 men who governed themselves by their own code, shared prizes by their own rules, and answered to no authority except the collective agreement of the crew. They called themselves the Flying Gang. The names attached to that harbor read like the cast of every pirate story ever told. Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Edward Thatch, who would become Blackbeard, Samuel Bellamy, Calico Jack Rackham. As historian Colin Woodard documented in The Republic of Pirates, this was the closest thing to a functioning pirate democracy the Atlantic world had ever seen. By 1717, British merchants were losing what in modern terms amounts to tens of millions of pounds annually to pirates operating from Nassau. The man chosen to end it had spent years doing, in the king's name, almost exactly what the men in Nassau were doing without it. Woods Rogers was born around 1679 in Poole, a port town on the Dorset coast, the eldest son of a merchant sea captain who held shares in several vessels, and the perpetual financial anxiety of someone whose livelihood moves with the weather. The family relocated to Bristol around 1696. Bristol was then the second largest city in England, and one of its most important ports, a place where the smell of the sea was inseparable from the smell of money, where conversations were about cargo routes and cargo prices, and which ships had been lost and which had come in heavy. In 1697, at 18, Rogers was apprenticed to a Bristol mariner named John Yeamans for 7 years. He completed the apprenticeship in 1704. The following January, he married Sarah Whetstone, daughter of Rear Admiral Sir William Whetstone, a close family friend. The marriage made Rogers a freeman of the city and connected him to a network of naval and merchant contacts that would matter in the years ahead. He was 25, newly married, with a future that looked like the comfortable trajectory of a Bristol merchant captain. Then his father died. In 1706, the elder Woods Rogers died at sea, leaving his son in charge of the family shipping business and the debts accumulated around it. The War of the Spanish Succession had been bad for Bristol merchants. French privateers had taken or destroyed several vessels in which Rogers held an ownership interest. At least one ship, the Whetstone Galley, named for his father-in-law, had been captured by the French before it even reached its destination. Between 1706 and 1708, Woods and Sarah had a son and 2 daughters. He was a man with 3 children, a failing business, and no good options on land. In 1707, his father's associate, the legendary navigator Captain William Dampier, already twice circumnavigator of the globe, came to Rogers with a proposition: a privateering expedition against Spanish commerce in the Pacific. He needed a captain. He needed financing. Rogers was not looking for adventure. He was looking for a way out of his father's debts. The proposition Dampier laid in front of him was not romantic. It was practical. It was also, looked at honestly, the same calculation the men of Nassau were making simultaneously, that the sea, with the right license, was a faster route to solvency than anything on land. He said yes. He went home to Sarah and the children and explained what he was going to do. Whether she understood that he might not come back is not recorded. What is recorded is that he left. On the 1st of August, 1708, the Duke and the Duchess sailed out of Bristol Harbour. He would not see Bristol again for 3 years. When he came back, he would be a national hero, a bankrupt, a man with a shattered jaw and a dead brother, and the most qualified person in England for the job that was waiting for him. The Duke was a 3-masted frigate of 320 tons, carrying 30 guns. The Duchess was 260 tons and 26 guns. Together, they carried 334 men, a fractious collection of Bristol mariners, foreign sailors, and what Rogers described in his journal as tinkers and tailors, who had signed on without quite understanding what they had signed on for. Dampier was the pilot. Rogers was the captain, responsible for everything else. He suppressed a mutiny off Ireland. He replaced the deserters. He pushed south. They rounded Cape Horn in the southern winter, which drove them to nearly 62 degrees south latitude, closer to the undiscovered Antarctic than to South America. The cold was extreme, the rigging iced. Men who had signed on in Bristol were now experiencing the Southern Ocean directly, understanding for the first time that the distance between a brave decision made in a warm office and the physical reality of executing it could be very large. On the 1st of February 1709, in the Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile, The Duke's lookout spotted a fire on shore. Rogers sent a boat in the morning. The boat came back with a man dressed in goatskins, his face weathered past recognition, his speech so far gone from disuse that he could barely make himself understood. Alexander Selkirk had been marooned on that island in September 1704, 4 years and 4 months before Rogers found him. He had been a sailing master on a privateering voyage who had quarreled with his captain over the seaworthiness of their ship and asked to be put ashore. The captain had obliged. Selkirk had spent the next 52 months alone, hunting wild goats, taming cats, keeping himself sane through routine and prayer. Rogers described him in his journal as clothed in goat skins and looking wilder than the first owners of them. He called him, with what seems like genuine respect, the governor of the island. He took him aboard and gave him command of one of the prize ships they would later capture. Daniel Defoe, Rogers' acquaintance in London, would later use Selkirk's story as the seed of Robinson Crusoe. But for Rogers, in the moment, it was one detail in a voyage that was growing more expensive with every passing month. Thomas, his younger brother, was dead, killed in a naval engagement somewhere in the Pacific. Rogers had sailed with his brother. He had not sailed home with him. Whether he grieved visibly, his journal does not record. His journal is a document of what happened, not of what it cost. What happened next was the prize he had spent 2 months waiting for. From October 1709, Rogers positioned his small fleet off the Mexican coast near Cabo San Lucas and waited. He had intelligence that the Manila galleons, the annual Spanish treasure ships running between Acapulco and the Philippines, would pass this way. He waited 2 months. 2 months at anchor with a crew that had already crossed the Pacific, already lost men to scurvy and fever and battle, already buried his brother somewhere in waters that could not be precisely mapped. On the 22nd of December 1709, the horizon changed. Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación y Desengaño, Our Lady of the Incarnation and Disappointment, appeared off Cabo San Lucas. She was a Manila galleon, loaded with Chinese goods, silks, and spices. Her captain, a Frenchman named Jean Presberti, had made the mistake of stowing all his heavy guns in the hold to make room for cargo. She carried 193 men, and could answer Rogers' attack with nothing heavier than small arms and light deck guns. The engagement was brief. 20 Spanish dead, 9 British, and Woods Rogers took a Spanish musket ball through his left cheek. The ball struck away a great part of his upper jaw and several of his teeth, as he recorded in his own journal with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who had decided that what happened to his face was simply data to be logged. Some crew accounts add that he swallowed a fragment of his own jawbone in the chaos of the engagement. Whether the shock overrode the sensation in the moment, his journal does not address. What it records is that he continued commanding. 2 days later, the Desengaño's companion galleon, Begonia, appeared. 450 men, 60 guns, fully armed. Rogers went after her anyway. His 4 ships fired more than 500 cannon shots. The Begonia did not surrender. Rogers broke off the attack, made worse when a splinter tore through his left foot, striking out part of his heel bone and cutting nearly through his ankle. He lay on his back on the quarterdeck, dictating orders, unable to stand, bleeding through the bandages, with a jaw that would never properly heal. The Desengaño was renamed the Bachelor. Alexander Selkirk was appointed her sailing master. The fleet sailed west. Guam, the East Indies, the Indian Ocean, Cape Town, and up through the Atlantic. On the 14th of October 1711, 4 British warships escorted Rogers' ships up the Thames. He had circumnavigated the globe, brought his original ships home, kept most of his men alive, and captured a Manila galleon. Only the 4th such capture in 3 centuries of the trade route's existence. The prize was estimated at £150,000 to £170,000. The investors doubled their money. He was a national hero. His book, A Cruising Voyage Round the World, published in 1712, sold well, particularly the section about Selkirk, which Daniel Defoe read carefully. He was also a man in pieces. His jaw had been badly repaired during the voyage, leaving him with a permanent facial deformity and difficulty speaking. His brother was dead in the Pacific. His wife Sarah was in Bristol, with 3 children he had not seen in 3 years. The legal action from his crew arrived almost immediately. By 1712, Rogers was bankrupt. His fourth child, a boy, was born the following year and died in infancy. Woods and Sarah Rogers permanently separated. He sold his Bristol house. He was a celebrated, ruined, physically damaged man in his early 30s, with a jaw that hurt when he spoke and no good options on land. He looked at what was in front of him the same way he had looked at the horizon off Cabo San Lucas. What was waiting in 1717 was Nassau. On the 22nd of April, 1718, Woods Rogers sailed out of the Thames with 7 ships, 100 soldiers, 130 colonists, a chest full of royal pardons, and a crate of religious pamphlets. The pamphlets were his idea. He genuinely believed that the pirates of Nassau would respond to spiritual instruction. The king's pardon was real and unconditional. Any pirate who surrendered before September 5, 1718, would be forgiven every act of piracy they had ever committed. Rogers had lobbied for the terms himself. He understood, better than the men in London who drafted the proclamation, that you could not simply hang 2,000 people. You had to give them a door. What he carried in that crate of pamphlets was his belief that the door was sufficient. The fleet arrived off New Providence on the 24th of July, 1718. Charles Vane was waiting. Vane was the most intractable pirate in the Caribbean. He had refused every pardon, had harassed the Royal Navy vessel that delivered the earlier proclamation, and had made clear to anyone who would listen that he intended to die free or not at all. When Rogers' fleet appeared at the harbor entrance, Vane had one move left, and he made it. He set fire to a captured French vessel and sent it directly at Rogers' ships. The burning ship drifted toward Rogers' fleet in the narrow harbor entrance, forcing the naval vessels to scatter. In the confusion, Vane slipped out of the western end of the harbor with 90 men in a fast sloop, firing his cannons at Rogers as he passed. He was gone before Rogers could organize a pursuit. Rogers brought his fleet into the harbor anyway. On the shore, Benjamin Hornigold was waiting with an honor guard of former pirates who had decided, before Rogers' ships even entered the harbor, that the pardon was preferable to whatever came next. Hornigold had essentially founded the Republic of Pirates. He had mentored Blackbeard. He had more institutional knowledge of how Nassau worked than almost anyone alive. And now he had made the calculation that Rogers respected, because it was exactly the one Rogers himself would have made. The era was ending, and the question was whether you wanted to be on the right side of what came next. As David Cordingly documented in Pirate Hunter of the Caribbean, Rogers immediately commissioned Hornigold as a pirate hunter, giving him ships, authority, and the task of pursuing the men who had refused the pardon. The first weeks were a catalogue of disasters. Disease killed nearly 100 of Rogers' people, while the long-term residents of Nassau were nearly untouched. 2 of his 3 Royal Navy escorts sailed for New York without orders to remain. The third left in September, its commander promising to return in 3 weeks with no intention of keeping that promise. Rogers was left with a shrinking garrison, former pirates who were not, as he wrote to London in February 1721, the people I ought to think will make any land improvements, and a fort falling apart around him. He rebuilt it on his own credit. London did not respond promptly. It rarely did. On the 14th of September, Rogers received word that Vane had been spotted 120 miles north of Nassau. Several pardoned pirates sailed to join him. Rogers sent Hornigold after them. Hornigold returned without Vane, but with 10 captured men. Rogers put them on trial on the 9th of December, 1718. The court sat in His Majesty's guardroom. The men pleaded not guilty, despite, as the Admiralty Court records note, the overwhelming evidence against them. 9 were convicted. One man, John Hips, was reprieved after convincing the court he had sailed under duress. Rogers reprieved 1 more, a man of good family. The remaining 8 were sentenced to death. On the morning of December 12th, they were hanged. Thomas Morris climbed the steps and said what he said. "We have a good governor, but a harsh one," and was hanged. Rogers watched. He had organized this. He had presided over the trial. He had signed the death warrants. He stood in the harbor of a city he had rebuilt with his own credit and watched 8 men die. The crowd understood, in a way they had not understood before, that the era they had been living in was over. Within days, a conspiracy to overthrow Rogers was discovered. He had the conspirators flogged and released, calculating correctly that the hangings had made further resistance unlikely. The Republic of Pirates was finished. The problem with building something in a place that doesn't want to be built is that the building never stops costing you. Rogers had arrived in Nassau with a genuine vision, a reformed colony of former pirates turned productive colonists, farming the land, trading legitimately. He had brought the religious pamphlets. He had hired former pirates rather than imprisoning them, trusting that men who had chosen the sea for reasons of necessity rather than character could choose differently under different conditions. The reality dismantled this vision piece by piece. The pardoned pirates were skilled sailors who had built their lives around the pirate articles, a share of the prize, a voice in decisions, the right to move on when a situation was no longer profitable. The colonial economy Rogers was trying to build offered none of these things. Many of them left. Those who stayed were, as Rogers noted with increasing bitterness, impossible to motivate and difficult to discipline. He was trying to build a colony with the people who had specifically rejected the kind of society a colony was designed to create. The financial situation deteriorated in parallel. Rogers was buying everything on credit: materials, supplies, the labor his garrison could no longer provide as fever reduced its numbers. London sent sympathy, London sent pamphlets, London did not send money. In March 1719, Spain and Britain went to war again. Rogers redoubled the fortification work. In May, a Spanish fleet appeared off Nassau. He had the guns manned and ready. The Spanish commander, learning that the French had captured Pensacola and that his strategic situation had changed, turned away without attacking. Rogers had defended Nassau with walls he had built on his own debt, against a fleet that decided not to fight. In 1719, Hornigold was dead, his ship wrecked in a hurricane on an uncharted reef somewhere between New Providence and New Spain. Rogers had lost his most effective instrument. In 1721, Rogers sailed for England. He left behind a colony that was functioning, barely. He left behind a motto carved into the colonial badge. He arrived in England and was immediately arrested for debt. The debtors' prison in England in the 1720s was a place of suspension, a holding condition where you waited until your creditors accepted terms or gave up. For a man who had crossed the Southern Ocean, taken a musket ball in the jaw, and defended a Caribbean colony against a Spanish fleet, it was, in its particular way, the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to him. Rogers sat in a debtor's prison from 1721 until his creditors moved on. While he sat there, Nassau deteriorated under his successor, Governor Thenny, who accomplished very little in 7 years. The colony Rogers had built was not destroyed, but neglect in the Caribbean operates faster than neglect in England. During this period, a book changed the public perception of what he had done. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 and widely believed to have been written by Daniel Defoe, described Rogers' governorship in heroic terms. It made the golden age of piracy into legend and, in doing so, made Rogers the man who had ended it. His reputation restored by a book about the people he had hanged, Rogers was granted a royal pension backdated to 1721 and appointed governor of the Bahamas for a second term in October 1728. He was 50 years old. His jaw still hurt. Sarah was gone. He had no particular reason to go back to Nassau, except that it was the place where he had done something that mattered, and there was apparently still work to do there. He arrived in 1728 and found the colony in decline. He rebuilt the defenses again. He summoned an assembly and tried to levy a tax to pay for the fortifications. The assembly refused. Rogers dissolved the assembly. The constitutional crisis that followed exhausted him, in a way that Spanish fleets and pirate conspiracies apparently had not. He went to Charleston in 1731 to recover his health. He returned. On the 15th of July, 1732, Woods Rogers died in Nassau. He was approximately 53 years old. He had arrived in the city 14 years earlier with 7 ships, 100 soldiers, a chest of pardons, and a crate of religious pamphlets. He died in the city he had saved, alone, in debt again, his health broken, his wife long gone, his brother dead in the Pacific, his jaw bearing the scar of a musket ball he had taken in the service of an expedition that had made him bankrupt. A harborside street in Nassau was named after him. Expulsis piratis restituta commercia. Pirates expelled, commerce restored. It was Rogers' personal motto, and it became the official motto of the Bahamas, inscribed on the colonial badge, printed on official documents for the next 255 years, until the islands gained independence in 1973. 2.5 centuries. The motto of a man who died in debt outlasted the man himself by more than 200 years. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1718, there were somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 active pirates operating in the Caribbean and Atlantic. By 1726, fewer than 200. The decline was not entirely Rogers' doing. The execution of Blackbeard by Lieutenant Robert Maynard in November 1718, organized by Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, emboldened by Rogers' example, removed the most famous pirate alive. The hanging of Bartholomew Roberts' crew in 1722, the largest mass piracy trial in history, broke the organizational networks that had sustained the Golden Age. But Rogers was the hinge. By destroying Nassau as a base of operations, by forcing the dispersal of the flying gang, he had made all subsequent actions possible. The men who had accepted his pardon went different ways. Hornigold died in a hurricane in 1719. Charles Vane, who had escaped with a fireship, was eventually captured and hanged in Jamaica in 1721. Calico Jack Rackham was taken off Jamaica in November 1720 and hanged. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, taken with Rackham, were both reprieved on grounds of pregnancy. Mary Read died in prison. Anne Bonny's fate is one of the genuine mysteries of the period. The historical record simply stops, and she disappears into whatever life she made afterward. Blackbeard, who had sailed north to North Carolina rather than face Rogers, was killed by Maynard on the 22nd of November, 1718, just 10 days after Rogers' 8 pirates were hanged in Nassau Harbor. The two events bookend the moment when the golden age of piracy, in any meaningful operational sense, ended. The portrait of Woodes Rogers that survives, painted by William Hogarth in 1729, a year into his second term, shows a composed man with a slight asymmetry to his jaw that the painter has not entirely concealed. His son William stands beside him. Through a window in the background, a ship is visible on the water. He is holding a map. He looks like exactly what he was, a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it at a cost that doesn't appear in the painting, but was there in the jaw and the eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to carry weight without advertising it. The statue of Woodes Rogers outside the British Colonial Hotel in Nassau today shows him reaching for his pistol, the posture of a man who has not yet decided whether the situation requires shooting. It is, unintentionally, a precise image of what he was, not a man of violence by nature, not a man of peace by conviction, but a man permanently in the moment before the decision, calculating what was required and preparing to do it. The question Woodes Rogers raises, and never answers, because it is not the kind of question that gets answered, is where exactly the line falls. He was a privateer. He raided enemy ships under a royal patent. The men he hanged in Nassau Harbor had done the same thing, many of them during the same war, on the same seas, with the same methods, without the patent. The patent was the difference, the piece of paper, the legal authorization that transformed an act of maritime violence into an act of service to the Crown. This is not a trivial distinction. Law is built on exactly this kind of distinction, the same act meaning different things depending on who authorized it, and the authorization mattering, and the civilization requiring that it matter, because without it there is nothing between order and chaos except whoever happens to be strongest. Rogers understood this. He had organized his entire life around it. He had crossed the Southern Ocean and taken a musket ball in the jaw in its service. But he had also stood on a deck with a shattered face and understood, at some level his journal could not record, that the men on the other side were doing what he was doing, that the distance between them was the patent and not the man. He hanged 8 of them anyway, because the patent was real, because the law required it, because an empire that allows its governors to make exceptions based on sympathy is an empire that has decided to stop being an empire. He was the kind of man who understood the system he served well enough to serve it without illusions, and that is rarer than it sounds, and more costly than it looks. There is a kind of person who does the necessary thing at the necessary moment and pays the full price for it, and does not ask for recognition or relief, because they understood from the beginning that neither was coming. Woodes Rogers was that kind of person. He went to Nassau because it needed doing. He built something with debt and fever, and men who didn't want to be built with. He died in the city he had saved, owing money to people who had helped him save it. The motto outlasted him by 2 centuries. The city outlasted the motto. The sea that made him and broke him outlasts everything. Some men spend their lives becoming the thing they were always going to be. Woodes Rogers spent his life becoming the thing the world required, and the price of that was everything else. And somewhere in Nassau Harbor, on a December morning in 1718, a man named Thomas Morris climbed the gallows steps and said, "We have a good governor, but a harsh one." He was right on both counts.